one of the enemies many of us have is time. And Emerson, for example, talks about something interesting that happens in the present moment with time. He uses this analogy of a rose and how the rose just is in total perfection. When the rose is just a little bud, it's perfect. When it's fully formed, it's perfect. It's not thinking about, past, future. And he talks about this idea that when we live like the rose and when we have this state of presence or drop into this consciousness of presence, time almost disappears. He calls it, we go above time, he says.
Yeah. It's hard to get words on to where it reflects it accurately, but it is that. I mean, it's that most of us time is linear, mm-hmm. but the actual experience is like the actual, you know what I mean?
There's
like
no word.
It's the isness only.
Uh-huh.
And time is sort of like a past and a future, which isn't the is. So time is basically talking about something which isn't, but that we believe in, and therefore we don't give our attention to the now. And it's sort of like, instead of being linear, like the now is sort of like this little gap. Mm-hmm. And it's something like when you slide into the now, instead of it just being this fleeting, suddenly it's like, it's like this.
One way I've heard it described is it's razor thin, but infinitely deep.
And when you slide into it, it's like suddenly it's opens up and, and it's everywhere. Right. You know what I mean? Like not only deep, but it's
wide
and present and yes, and has been the only thing going on the whole time, actually.
So there are no practices, I think you said at one point, for getting in this present space.
Nothing essential.
But there are certainly, but you do teach yoga.
Yes.
And then I take yoga and teach yoga as well. And so is that a tool for getting into this place? I mean, what's the role of yoga or meditation or some of these things that we would call practices, I guess?
Yeah, okay. Well, like the practices would be, basically what I'm doing is practicing getting online. The more time I'm online, but that's a funny way to say it too. But the more the more online, the more I realize that the online state is sort of ever present, then it's sort of like the practices are getting out of the habit of doing something else. The way I talk about it often is like you're learning to get into a place where you're not thinking quite so much. And when you're not thinking quite so much, suddenly the download is right there. Like you find yourself knowing whatever you need to know without dredging up. Like Krishnamurti used to talk about thinking as like the regurgitation of the past. So like instead of thinking, regurgitating the past to come up with answers about knowing what to do or not do. Stop thinking to the best of your ability. You'll still be conscious. In other words, consciousness and thinking are not equivalent. Put your thinking on hold. You'll still be conscious. And at that point, it's sort of like the window of your mind is receptive to the download, and you find yourself knowing what to do. And so, which is helpful. I mean, like you need to know what to do. I mean, you're living a life and you got concerns and problems and stuff you got to figure out. And you can either try to figure them out the old way, or you can start figuring out a better way. And the better way seems to be, instead of using your thinking, use your thinking to remind yourself to listen. So the practice is do stuff that helps you tune in. Silent-minded is the usual spiritual stuff, like quiet-minded. And that's been the prescription, because when you quiet-mind it, it's not like you're left with nothing at that point. So like when I first started hearing about the quiet mind, I was talking with a friend and he said, why would you want to get into the thought-free quiet mind? Like, it sounds idiotic, it sounds moronic, it sounds like how does that answer your questions? But when you do it, it's like, because consciousness is being conscious as you, then when you silent mind it, the download flows in, and you find yourself being a little smarter than you were a moment ago. So like the quiet mind, any practices that help you think less, essentially, and tune in, make you receptive to insight. And the insight will be relevant, or, to whatever your predicament is. So I'm thinking, cool. So that's the practice, or the practices are about letting go of what you think you know. It's that thing, like the smarter you get, the more you realize how little you know. And so don't rely so much on the little you know. But if that was the total story, it would be a bummer. Don't rely so much on the little you know. Instead, be smart enough to get online again, listen again, open to the Supreme again. Mm-hmm. And if you're lucky, but it happens, then the knowing that you need flows in.